I'm actually excited to start sharing several of my personal projects publicly, in part just to kind of get into the habit of putting out, content. But then also more importantly, just to kind of share with you where I've been in life. So maybe consider this a mix of a presentation as well as kind of maybe like a mini vlog or something like that. So one thing that I've been working on ever since probably December actually is I've really been trying to summarize my beliefs and kind of put them in one place, especially when I'm going through kind of difficult times, hard times, as well as to just practice organizing. Organizing is not like easy for me at all. So, but as I've been doing that, or at least when I started, I realized that one, I focused on the hero's journey because that's something that's of interest to me. I think the hero's journey is a good summary of what I need to go through at the very least experientially, in order to become the type of person I want to become. But as I was doing that, I realized, you know, throughout all the many sources that I've exposed myself to throughout my life, there seem to be four common stages, or there are at least a few common stages, maybe not four, but where people in real life, people in fiction, all across these contexts, there seem to be these recurring patterns, these recurring themes, and these recurring warnings that I hear, especially from people in real life, who are my heroes. So basically, this is my version two of creating a draft of, trying to summarize my understandings and kind of make it meaningful to me. And so I'm just going to walk you through what I have. Keep in mind, this is still a draft. This is not like I'm not publishing this anytime soon. That's probably not going to be for another year or two, assuming that I get what I need into it. But I just want to share now, just in the event that you find value in it, or at least find value in some of the resources contained within this draft. So let me go ahead and get started with that. So starting off, this, I have a table of contents, and these are mostly all drafts. I would say, if anything, the only sections that I feel like are truly done are this one sentence summary, because I think it's very simple. And then I actually think the images in stage one are the most, probably the best that I'm going to get, and then probably also the examples. So stage one is probably the closest to completion. Um, Probably also because I've just lived through that stage the most in my 26 years on Earth. So obviously there's a table of contents. I did so from the last time. So any of you who saw version one, so version two, I actually added a preface, and I'm gonna probably edit this as needed, and then probably I want to preface by the time I'm done. But there was something that I realized. I was reading a lot of James Clear articles, and there was a quote that he had in there that really spoke to me, which was, "To write a great book, you must first become the book." And I definitely am a believer in that. I hate hearing advice from people who don't live what they say or don't have any sort of success that I can respect. So, for me, this preface, feel free to read it at your leisure, but basically all it's saying is, you know, I don't want this to be a mere intellectual exercise. I don't want this to just be fun and, oh, I found these patterns and I'm done. No, I think that, especially when it comes to something this personal and so raw for me, the only way that I'm gonna feel satisfied publishing it is if I've gone through all four stages myself and I know firsthand what that's like. Because there's a very big difference between talking about something from like a secondhand point of view where things intellectually make sense, and there's a very big difference between that and actually living it. Because when you live it, there are just some nuances that, especially emotionally and internally, that just people on the outside are never going to understand. So that's kind of my commitment to myself. I'm not going to publish this in any sort of ebook or physical copy, until I do that. So scrolling down to the one sentence summary, so I stole this basically from Dave Powers from Objective Personality, which is that system is very influential on me. So I'll just read it. The hero's journey is a series of external tests that, when passed, transform the inner self. Right. Really great summary. And then kicking off, I goes to stage one. Now, for those of you who read version one, this is a little bit different. Before, I just called it a downward spiral, but for me specifically, this the endpoint seems to always be suicide or suicidal ideation, right? And that's my issue. I'm not, and let me be super clear. This book, in a sense, is for me. right, for me to use when I'm struggling. So I'm not saying everyone feels suicidal, probably not. Like, but I do think that everyone probably relates to a downward spiral. I definitely do think people relate to kind of the addiction language that I use throughout this stage and relapsing, right? Even if it's something as simple as relapsing on candy or something like that, when you're supposed to be eating healthy. But for me, I I named it this way not for shock value, or not primarily for shock value, but more so to wake myself up, right? And be like, look, like if you go down this path and if you start giving in, you're not gonna be around, because I've had many experiences, and I talk about it in this section, where as I start going down these binges and downward spirals, there comes a point where like I can't physically be around like trains, balconies, cars. Like I do not trust myself, because there's such an emotional temptation to just end it, right? And so I do not want to go back there, and so that's why I'm using language as strong as I am. Now, this is super draft level, so I would say, much like everything else, just kind of skim it if you're reading Mark 2. This is not complete, right? There's just like there's like a lot of half sentences in the second half, and like I'm not really sure what I need to say in the second half, and so don't worry necessarily about that, so I wouldn't worry about that. Now, as for the images, which I mentioned is probably the most complete, one of the most complete sections in this draft right now, is so for each section I have certain images or certain things that come to mind that help depict that stage to me and remind me, and I think it's valuable to share. So for example, with I'm not going to go through all of these, but Euphoria, for those of you who are Euphoria fans or stans, right? For those of you who are familiar, the one of the main, well, really the main character, but there's many main characters, but the main character, Rue Bennett, is a drug addict, and that's like they established that in episode 1, right? I'm not spoiling anything, but there are certain images and certain scenes in there that have really spoken to me, because not only is it like terrifying and like this kind of dark, chaotic thing, for example, her relapsing, or her, yelling at her drug dealer, right? Or, but they're also extremely relatable, because I've definitely been there in life, right? Where not necessarily, I've never done hard drugs, right? So let me be super clear. But whenever I'm relapsing on, even something as simple as like a YouTube binge, or like a, social media binge, there's a point where it's like I get very irritable, and I get like very kind of accusatory and blamey, and it's just not good. It's not good, but it reflects that. So there's several other images. I'm not going to go through all of them, because this is a summary. But I will include all of them here. And then finally, the examples, evidence, and encouragement to get to the next stage. Again, this is for me, when I'm in this state. But I would say this is probably the clearest. So one, I'm very big into. I definitely believe that tiny wins and tiny losses are extremely powerful, and often overlooked because they're so small. But the I am beginning, especially because of James Clear and because of Jordan Peterson's work, actually, I'm definitely a believer that small failures or small successes not only affect you, but they affect everyone in the social network. And in many cases, you know, I don't want to be too abstract here, but in many cases, we have a fractal relationship with reality, right? So the more we're failing, the more the outside world is going to fail, because we're not filling in our role in that world to not only, do what we need to do as an individual, but we're not encouraging the rest of the group to do something similar, because we do imitate each other. So there's a lot of quotes there. There's a lot of quotes on addiction, how addiction operates, how relapses operate, right? In tiny wins, right? The importance of doing 2-minute habits or less. So that's kind of something to look into. Now, stage 2 is this is more where it's going to be a lot more messy. I'm not fully done with the rest of the stages, but the valley of disappointment. Now, this one I have a lot of experience with, but this is actually something that I took from James Clear, which I'm very grateful for. And basically, the basic concept is that a lot of people, including myself, assume that when we start doing good things, progress is going to be linear, right? It's like, okay, if I put in 50 hours of work, I should see quote unquote 50 hours of progress, right? But the problem is that most progress is hidden, right? There's a lot of things that are happening underneath the surface. And then on top of that, there's a certain inertia, let's say, in the outside world, especially socially, that you need to overcome. So for example, for me, I'll just use my example. So like there are a lot of things I'm starting to do socially, right? I'm trying to get back into social media in a healthy way, right? But trying to contribute, trying to be, kind, and do things like that. But because of my many, many, many mistakes, probably especially over the past 2 years, it's going to take a while for those to show up, right? Or the benefits or the consequences to show up. So this is a very inspiring realization that it's normal to feel disappointed despite doing all the right things for a long time, right? Like James Clear even goes so far as to say it could even take between months and years before you start seeing any benefits of your good decisions. So so there's like a encouragement of the pain is normal, so you don't quit prematurely, and then also there's this kind of hope that it provides of okay, yes, if you're doing the right things, give it a year or two, and then if by the end of the year or by the end of 2 years you're not seeing it, then there's a problem. So there's a patience that's encouraged. But again, like the wording is a little bit not complete. Same thing with the images. I do have a few images that I do like, but they're not complete. But for example, there's an analogy from David Allen from Getting Things Done. Bruce Wayne from The Dark Knight Rises, climbing or trying to climb the pit, but he's failing again and again. I think that's a really good image as well, because what's interesting is that he's failing. I don't want to say necessarily in different ways, but he's failing for different reasons every time. So it's like he built up his body, failed, built up his body and his anger, right, to help him get some emotion, failed. And then finally, after building all those subcomponents, he had like this missing piece of you need fear as well. And that in combination with all of his work got him out. It wasn't just the fear, because if he had the fear but he didn't train, he would have fell, right? So to his death, right? So that's a really good image for me. And there's a few others, but again, I'm not this will be worked on. Now, oh, and then finally, evidence. Sorry, evidence. There's a lot of addiction related stuff, because again, that's kind of one of my primary fights that I have to make. Just a lot of things related to withdrawal and relapse, like what happens to the brain, what you can expect emotionally, right? But then also I have like a lot of things in reference to just people who've been in that dark situation of like doing the right things and not seeing anything. And then but eventually climbing out. Like, so for example, I have David Goggins, who was like what 298 pounds, and he had to lose weight in 3 months at like 105 pounds or something crazy like that. And the first time he ran, he thought he intended to run 4 miles, but he only ran half a mile because he wasn't physically fit, and he like walked home and cried because he's like, man, he quit his job, he was trying to do the right things, but like there was this huge disappointment of, man, I just quit my job and I can't even run a mile. What do I do? But from there he picked himself up, he encouraged himself, and then he got out and did amazing things. Similarly with Kobe Bryant, there are a few notorious stories, but for the sake of this simplicity, there's a story of him. I think it's his first year in the league, where he's a rookie. I think he's about 18, 19 years old. He's super young. He was dominating in high school, so he had this expectation of dominating. And there was this one game against, I think it was the Utah Jazz or something like that, where he shot 4 air balls in a row, and they lost the game because, like, really in large part because he didn't pass the ball and he tried to shoot it. And that's very demoralizing, very discouraging. But then what he did was, first he went home or went to the gym, locked himself in the gym, and then shot free throws or shot basketball shots, just like the one he did in the game, until the sun came up. Like, he did it very early in the morning. And then from there, he created a routine like he always does. And he was like, hey, look, okay, let me just work on my endurance. Let me work on getting out of this. And then eventually, I think it was even the next year, they won a championship. It was either the next year or the year after. So there's images like that, but there's more images. But again, these aren't perfect. There's going to be some that aren't that great that I'll remove. Now, stage 3 is actually kind of interesting. So this one I don't hear a lot of people talk about, like, especially for those of you who are in the objective personality community. I'm surprised that Dave and Shane don't talk about this aspect of the hero's journey, because it's so common. Like, it's so common even in the stories of the hero's journey. And what I mean by that is there's always this moment where things are going well for you, right? And everyone all of a sudden is your friend and you're the hero, but then what ends up happening is it's almost like a temptation to be lazy, basically, right? So it's like, so in this section, it talks about how, okay, well, you put in your work, you put in 1 to 2 years of work, or maybe even 10 years of silence, some people call it. And then finally people are giving you respect, you're getting money now, you're getting recognition, right? You're getting all this, all these promotional deals, you're living in a better place, maybe you started a great romantic relationship, right? So all this stuff is great. But then what ends up happening is, like, what happens? A vast majority of people just end up getting lost, and they get distracted by those pleasures, and then they lose everything, right? So one image that I haven't written down actually, but that I should, is Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson's super notorious for that. He was the top of his game. He was like, what? I don't know if he was heavyweight, but he was definitely a world champion at boxing for like a good 4 or 5 years in a row. but then he got all this money, and then he spent all his money on drugs, women, liquor, like all the vices, and then like he lost everything, right? And that's something that's like a pitfall that most people don't realize, it seems, when they're pursuing success. It's like, okay, yes, the success might kill you, right? Like, or the success might ruin you if you get distracted by that. So there's some images in here. I definitely need to add Mike Tyson because he's a really great example. But there's a few other ones from like anime and stuff like that. And then finally, from an evidence standpoint, just kind of, this one's also very messy, but basically the principle is you have to focus on the process, right? The results are great, but if you start focusing on results or goals, you're you're only motivated to get that goal, and then once you get that goal, you have nothing else to live for, you have nothing else to move forward for, right? So that's the basic principle of that. And then finally, stage four. This one is very woo woo. I need to reword it, but basically, there's this thing that happens with people, a very small minority of people, but it's very well documented, where after between 10 and 20 years of deliberate practice, like they become like basically a different person, right? And what ends up happening is like they're no longer worried about results. That you could pretty much put them anywhere on the planet in any circumstance, and they're gonna climb their way out and dominate. And there's just this peace, this like enlightenment. That's kind of the vibe. Like it's this mix of enlightenment, and then just kind of this focus of no matter what happens, I will handle it. And it's very deep emotional change, right? People who are enlightened, I would use as examples of that. But then also just like in the more, traditional business world, David Goggins is a great example, right? Where there was this moment, and I need to add this to the list as well. So David Goggins, he joined the military after he lost the weight. He was doing all this stuff. And there's this one 100-mile marathon that he did where he experienced this like born again experience. So I think it was like 100 laps around a 1 mile track. No, no, yeah, it was either that. I think it was that where I think it was him trying to qualify or something like that, or whatever. And he was trying to run it, and I think there were many other people on the track, and his ex-wife or former wife was there with him, and so he did 87 miles, right? He did 87 laps around this track, and then, by that time, I think what was his feet were broken, toes were broken, shins were broken, you know, it was like I think he started, not throwing up, but like peeing blood, like crazy shit, right? But then what ends up happening is he talks about at mile 87, his mind like switched, right? So instead of focusing on pain, and him hobbling, he realized, oh, I'm gonna run out of time, and I think it's not he sprinted, but he jogged the rest, like on broken bones, right? And then he reports getting home, right? His wife has to like carry him in the car. They call a doctor, they call the ambulance, and he's washing in the bath, in like with piss and urine and feces. I'm not trying to be explicit, but that is the story. And while he's in this bath suffering, he describes this like peace, right? This deep peace and joy in that came out of his mind just transforming like that. And then he talks about that as like a born again experience. It's like ever since that day, it's like he's never really been the same. He's been kind of more peaceful, more positive. And so that's an example of, you don't have to necessarily be on a mountaintop to experience this, but there has to be this switch. And the only way that switch happens is by consistency over a long period of time, right? And so that's kind of what I talk about here. I do think I need to find that Goggins example, but then there's also some images like, for me, there's a lot of Batman images where it's like Batman finally getting out of Gotham in the Dark Knight trilogy, right? He transforms himself into someone who is heroic and self-sacrificing enough to leave Batman behind for the next generation so that he doesn't have to, play that role anymore. Peter Parker in the first Spider-Man movie, transforming from Peter Parker to Spider-Man. And then finally, there's quite other anime examples and, Justice League examples and things like that. But then, Kobe Bryant, right, with his transformation into the Black Mamba is a huge identity change example. Again, I'll add the Goggins example, but then there's just like a lot of other examples throughout history and throughout like context where if you can make it, there is this born again experience that is not religious per se, but it feels like it's religious to the people that describe it. So that's basically it. And then finally, in this section, there is a conclusion, right? And the conclusion, I need to probably update this over time. This one's very insecure and just me venting emotions basically. But I think it's a good reference point. And so I would say that is the bulk of this draft. Again, I would, if you're gonna read this, if you're planning on reading this, do not treat this as a final edition by any means. This is truly gonna take me a while. If I'm not mistaken, books tend to take between 1 to 5 years to fully develop and publish in format. So don't, yeah, don't treat this necessarily as a book. Maybe just treat this as like, Reginald's, journal or blog or whatever, however you need to frame it. But I will put this in the description if it's not there already. The next version will be coming out March 16th, and I'll make a video on that as well. But other than that, just really happy I'm able to share this with you guys. I've been working on this slowly every day, so this is definitely going to take up a good portion of my time moving forward. So definitely looking forward to, if you guys have feedback or if you have any thing that you relate to in this doc, feel free to share that. But otherwise, I'm going to make another video now, and then I will head out. So hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys soon.